It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of service in the military, Marcus Carter had finally found a place where he could settle down with his family. A quiet, upscale neighborhood with well-kept homes, clean streets, and a sense of community. It seemed like the perfect place to raise his 8-year-old son, Ethan, who, like Marcus, was confined to a wheelchair due to a rare genetic condition. Marcus had sacrificed so much for his country, and now, all he wanted was peace. A place where his family could live without fear or judgment. The house was perfect. A modest 2-story home with a spacious backyard, just enough room for Ethan to play and for Marcus to tend to a small garden. The neighborhood, Willow Creek, was picturesque, with manicured lawns and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed by. Marcus and his wife, Claire, felt like they had finally found their safe haven. But lurking behind the pristine facade of Willow Creek was a darkness that Marcus couldn't have anticipated. A darkness that would soon threaten everything he held dear. It didn't take long for Marcus to notice her. Margaret Hayes, the self-proclaimed queen of Willow Creek. From the moment Marcus and his family moved in, Margaret made it clear that they were not welcome. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a sharp tongue and an even sharper glare. Her presence was suffocating, as if she owned the entire neighborhood and everyone in it. The first encounter was subtle. Marcus was unloading groceries from his van when he felt her eyes on him. He turned to see Margaret standing on her porch, arms crossed, staring at him with a look of disdain. He waved, trying to be friendly, but she didn't wave back. Instead, she muttered something under her breath and went inside. The comments started soon after. "I didn't think they let just anyone move in here," she said loudly to a neighbor as Marcus wheeled up his driveway. People like them should really consider a more accommodating neighborhood. Marcus tried to brush it off. He had dealt with prejudice before, and he wasn't about to let some bitter woman ruin his fresh start. But Margaret's hatred wasn't just casual rudeness. It was obsessive. She seemed determined to make Marcus and his family feel like they didn't belong. Margaret's harassment escalated quickly. She began filing petty complaints with the HOA, accusing Marcus of violating neighborhood rules. His lawn was too long, his van was parked incorrectly, his son's wheelchair ramp was an eyesore. Each complaint was baseless, but the HOA, intimidated by Margaret's domineering personality, always sided with her. Marcus tried to reason with her. "Margaret, we're just trying to live our lives," he said one afternoon after she confronted him about his lawn. "We're not here to cause trouble." But Margaret wasn't interested in reason. "This neighborhood has standards," she snapped. "And you and your disabled family don't meet them. You need to leave." Marcus clenched his fists but held his tongue. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about lawn care or parking. Margaret had a personal vendetta against him, and she wasn't going to stop until he was gone. The breaking point came one evening when Marcus was playing basketball with Ethan in the driveway. It was one of their favorite activities, a way for Marcus to bond with his son and forget about the stress of Margaret's constant harassment. But as they laughed and played, Marcus noticed Margaret watching them from her porch. Her expression was one of pure hatred. The next day, the police arrived. Marcus was inside the house when he heard the commotion. Heavy boots on the pavement, voices shouting orders. He looked out the window to see a swarm of armed officers surrounding his home. His heart raced as he realized what was happening. "Come out with your hands up," a voice boomed through a megaphone. Marcus wheeled himself to the door, his mind racing. What was going on? Why were the police here? Before he could process it, the door was kicked open and officers stormed inside, guns drawn. "Hands up. Now," they shouted. Marcus raised his hands, his heart pounding. "What's going on? What's happening?" "We received a tip that you're harboring a fugitive," one officer said, his voice cold. Marcus's stomach dropped. A fugitive? That was impossible. He hadn't had any visitors in months. But before he could explain, the officers began tearing through his house, overturning furniture, ripping through drawers, searching for something, or someone, that didn't exist. Ethan, terrified, clung to Marcus as the chaos unfolded. "Dad, what's happening?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Marcus held his son close, shielding him from the officer's aggression. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The police found nothing, of course. The tip was false, a malicious lie designed to ruin Marcus's life. But the damage had already been done. His house was in shambles, his son traumatized, and his sense of security shattered. As the officers left, Marcus knew exactly who was behind it. Margaret. She had finally made good on her threats, using the police as her personal enforcers. But Marcus wasn't going to let her get away with it. He had spent his life fighting for what was right, and he wasn't about to back down now. The next morning, Marcus filed a report with the police, detailing Margaret's harassment and the false tip that had led to the raid. The police, realizing they had been used, launched an investigation into Margaret's actions. What they found was shocking. Margaret had a history of filing false complaints against her neighbors, using the HOA and the police to bully anyone who didn't fit into her narrow vision of perfection. But that wasn't all. When the police searched her home, they discovered an illegal arsenal of weapons, guns, knives, and ammunition hidden in her basement. Margaret, the self-proclaimed protector of Willow Creek, was a danger to everyone around her. Margaret was arrested and charged with multiple counts of harassment, filing false police reports, and illegal possession of firearms. The trial was swift, and the verdict was clear. Margaret Hayes was going to prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, Margaret screamed at Marcus, blaming him for her downfall. "This is all your fault," she shouted. "You don't belong here. You never did." But Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. Margaret's reign of terror was over, and the neighborhood was finally free. With Margaret gone, Willow Creek began to heal. The HOA, once under her control, was restructured, and new rules were put in place to protect homeowners from harassment. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before began to come forward, sharing their own stories of Margaret's cruelty. Marcus and his family finally felt at peace. Ethan, no longer waking up in the middle of the night from nightmares, began to thrive. The neighborhood, once a place of fear and tension, became a true community. One evening, as Marcus sat in his backyard watching Ethan play basketball, he felt a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. The nightmare was over, and they were finally home. Life in Willow Creek had settled into a peaceful rhythm after Margaret Hayes was sent to prison. The neighborhood, once a battleground of tension and fear, had transformed into a welcoming community. Marcus Carter and his family finally felt like they belonged. Ethan, now more confident and happy, had even made a few friends in the neighborhood. Claire, Marcus's wife, had started a small garden in their backyard, and the family often spent evenings together, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. But beneath the surface of this newfound peace, a storm was brewing. Margaret Hayes, though incarcerated, was far from done. Her hatred for Marcus and his family had only deepened, and she was determined to make them pay for what she saw as her downfall. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus checked the mailbox and found a plain white envelope with no return address. His name was scrawled across the front in jagged, angry handwriting. He knew immediately who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper, filled with Margaret's venomous words. "You think you've won, Marcus. You think you can erase me from this neighborhood, from your life. But you're wrong. I'm not done with you. You don't belong here, and I'll make sure everyone knows it. Enjoy your peace while it lasts, because it won't last long. I'm coming for you." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had hoped that Margaret's imprisonment would be the end of her vendetta, but it seemed she was more determined than ever. He showed the letter to Claire, who frowned in concern. "What do you think she means by, 'I'm coming for you'?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I don't know," Marcus replied, his jaw tightening. "But we need to be careful. Margaret's not the type to make empty threats." A few days later, strange things began to happen around the neighborhood. Marcus's van was vandalized overnight, the tires slashed and the windows smashed. A few days after that, someone set fire to the small garden Claire had been tending. The police were called, but without any evidence, there was little they could do. Then came the rumors. Whispers began to circulate among the neighbors, suggesting that Marcus and his family were somehow responsible for the recent disturbances. "Maybe they're trying to get attention," one neighbor said. "Or maybe they're just trouble magnets," another added. Marcus knew exactly who was behind it. Margaret might have been in prison, but she still had allies, people who shared her twisted worldview and were willing to do her bidding. The harassment was escalating, and Marcus knew he had to act before things got out of hand. Marcus decided to take matters into his own hands. He reached out to an old friend from his military days, a private investigator named Jack Reynolds. Jack was a no-nonsense kind of guy, with a sharp mind and a knack for uncovering the truth. "I need your help, Jack," Marcus said over the phone. "Someone's trying to destroy my family, and I need to find out who's behind it." Jack agreed to take the case, and within days, he was in Willow Creek, digging into the recent events. It didn't take long for him to uncover a network of Margaret's supporters, neighbors who had been swayed by her rhetoric and were now carrying out her vendetta in her absence. One name stood out: Richard Grayson, a retired businessman who had been one of Margaret's closest allies. Richard had been vocal in his support for Margaret, even after her arrest, and Jack suspected he was the one orchestrating the recent attacks. Marcus and Jack confronted Richard at his home, a large, imposing house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Richard answered the door with a smug smile, as if he had been expecting them. "Marcus Carter," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We know what you've been doing, Richard," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "The vandalism, the fires, the rumors, it all leads back to you." Richard's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, crossing his arms. "But even if I did, what are you going to do about it? You're just a disabled vet with a chip on his shoulder. You don't scare me." Marcus took a step forward, his eyes locked on Richard's. "You're right, Richard. I'm just a disabled vet. But I've faced worse than you. And I'm not going to let you or anyone else destroy my family." Richard's smirk faded, replaced by a look of unease. He glanced at Jack, who was standing silently behind Marcus, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "You're making a mistake, Carter," Richard said, his voice low. "This isn't over." "No, it's not," Marcus replied. "But if you come after me or my family again, you'll regret it." Despite the confrontation, the harassment didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Marcus knew that Richard and his allies were trying to provoke him, to push him into doing something reckless. But Marcus wasn't going to fall into their trap. Instead, he and Jack devised a plan to expose Richard and his network once and for all. They set up surveillance cameras around Marcus's property, hoping to catch the culprits in the act. It didn't take long for their patience to pay off. One night, as Marcus and his family slept, the cameras captured a group of men sneaking onto their property. They were carrying cans of gasoline and matches, clearly intending to set fire to the house. But before they could act, the police, tipped off by Jack, arrived and arrested them. The men, all of whom were known associates of Richard Grayson, quickly confessed to their crimes. They admitted that Richard had been paying them to harass Marcus and his family, hoping to drive them out of the neighborhood. With the evidence against him mounting, Richard Grayson was arrested and charged with conspiracy, vandalism, and attempted arson. The trial was swift, and Richard's smug demeanor quickly faded as the weight of his crimes came crashing down on him. In the end, Richard was sentenced to several years in prison, a fitting punishment for his role in the harassment of Marcus and his family. The neighborhood, once again, breathed a sigh of relief. With Richard behind bars, Marcus hoped that the nightmare was finally over. But Margaret Hayes, still festering in her prison cell, had one last card to play. A few weeks after Richard's sentencing, Marcus received another letter from Margaret. This one was even more venomous than the last. "You may have won this round, Marcus, but the game isn't over. You think you're safe, but you're not. I have friends on the outside, and they're watching you. You'll never be free of me. Never." Marcus read the letter, his hands trembling with anger. He knew that Margaret would never stop, not as long as she had breath in her body. But he also knew that he couldn't let her control his life any longer. Marcus decided to take a stand. He gathered the neighborhood together and shared his story, from the moment he moved in to the recent events with Richard Grayson. The neighbors, many of whom had been swayed by Margaret's lies, listened in stunned silence. "We can't let fear and hatred divide us," Marcus said, his voice strong and clear. "This neighborhood is our home, and we have the power to make it a place where everyone feels welcome." The neighbors, inspired by Marcus's words, began to come together. They formed a new HOA, one that prioritized inclusivity and community over control and exclusion. Marcus was elected as the new president, and under his leadership, Willow Creek began to thrive. Years passed, and Margaret Hayes's name became little more than a cautionary tale in Willow Creek. The neighborhood, once a place of tension and fear, had transformed into a true community where everyone was welcome. Marcus and his family continued to thrive. Ethan, now a teenager, had become a confident and outgoing young man, thanks to the support of his family and neighbors. Claire's garden had grown into a beautiful oasis, a symbol of the family's resilience and strength. As for Marcus, he had finally found the peace he had been searching for. He had faced down his demons and emerged stronger than ever. And though he knew that Margaret's hatred would never truly die, he also knew that he had the power to rise above it. Margaret Hayes's death brought a strange mix of relief and unease to Willow Creek. For Marcus Carter and his family, it was the end of a long, painful chapter. The neighborhood had finally moved on from her toxic influence, and life had returned to a peaceful rhythm. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to resurface. A few weeks after Margaret's passing, Marcus received a package in the mail. It was a small, unmarked box with no return address. Inside, he found a stack of old photographs, letters, and a handwritten note. The note was from Margaret, written just before her death. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But don't think for a second that this is over. I've left behind a legacy, and it's up to you to decide what to do with it. The truth is buried in these pages. Find it, if you dare." Marcus's heart raced as he flipped through the photographs. They were old, faded pictures of Willow Creek from decades ago. Some showed Margaret as a young woman, standing proudly in front of her home. Others were of people Marcus didn't recognize, neighbors long gone, their faces frozen in time. But it was the letters that caught his attention. They were addressed to Margaret, written by someone named Evelyn. The tone was cryptic, filled with veiled threats and dark secrets. Marcus couldn't make sense of it all, but he knew one thing. Margaret had left behind a puzzle, and she wanted him to solve it. Marcus decided to dig deeper. He reached out to Jack Reynolds, his old friend and private investigator, for help. Together, they began to piece together the story behind Margaret's mysterious package. The first clue came from the photographs. One of them showed Margaret standing next to a man Marcus didn't recognize. Jack ran a facial recognition search and discovered that the man was Thomas Hayes, Margaret's late husband. Thomas had died under mysterious circumstances years ago, and his death had been ruled a suicide. But as Marcus and Jack dug deeper, they began to suspect that there was more to the story. The letters from Evelyn added another layer of intrigue. Evelyn, it turned out, had been Margaret's closest friend and her greatest rival. The two women had been involved in a bitter feud that had torn the neighborhood apart decades ago. Evelyn had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and her name had been all but erased from Willow Creek's history. "This isn't just about Margaret," Jack said as they pored over the letters. "This is about something much bigger, something that goes back years." As Marcus and Jack continued their investigation, they uncovered a shocking truth. Margaret and Evelyn had been part of a secret society that had once controlled Willow Creek. The society, known as the Circle, had been a powerful and shadowy group that manipulated the neighborhood for their own gain. They had used fear, intimidation, and even violence to maintain their grip on power. But the Circle had fractured when Margaret and Evelyn's feud turned deadly. Evelyn had tried to expose the group's secrets, and Margaret had stopped her permanently. Thomas Hayes's death had been part of the fallout, a cover-up to protect the Circle's legacy. Margaret wasn't just a bitter old woman, Jack said. She was the last surviving member of a secret society that ruled this neighborhood for decades. And she left this behind for you to find. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Margaret's vendetta against him hadn't just been personal. It had been part of a larger, darker plan. She had wanted to test him, to see if he was worthy of uncovering the truth. As Marcus and Jack delved deeper into the Circle's secrets, they began to notice strange things happening around the neighborhood. Cars would follow them at night, and their phones would buzz with unknown numbers. Someone was watching them, and it wasn't just Richard Grayson's old allies. One evening, Marcus returned home to find his house ransacked. The intruders had taken nothing of value, but they had left behind a single item, a black envelope with the Circle's symbol, a serpent coiled around a key, etched in gold. Inside the envelope was a message. "You've come too far to turn back now." The The circle is watching. Choose your next move carefully. Marcus knew that the circle wasn't just a relic of the past. It was still active, and its members were determined to protect their secrets, no matter the cost. Marcus decided to confront the circle head-on. He reached out to the few remaining members of the neighborhood who had been around during Margaret and Evelyn's time. Most were reluctant to talk, but one person agreed to meet with him, Evelyn's daughter, Sarah. Sarah had been just a child when her mother disappeared, but she had grown up hearing stories about the circle. She had spent years trying to uncover the truth about her mother's fate, and she was willing to help Marcus in exchange for his assistance. The circle isn't just a group of people, Sarah explained. It's an idea, a way of controlling the neighborhood through fear and manipulation. Margaret was the last of the old guard, but there are others who still believe in their cause. Marcus and Sarah formed an uneasy alliance, united by their desire to expose the circle's secrets. But as they worked together, they began to realize that the circle's influence ran deeper than they had imagined. The circle's members, realizing that Marcus and Sarah were getting too close, decided to strike back. One night, as Marcus and Sarah were reviewing evidence at his house, they heard a loud crash from the backyard. They rushed outside to find a group of masked figures setting fire to Marcus's shed. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and charged at the intruders, shouting for Sarah to call the police. The masked figures scattered, but not before one of them dropped a piece of paper. It was a list of names, members of the circle, both past and present. As the police arrived and the fire was extinguished, Marcus knew that he had finally found the key to bringing down the circle. But he also knew that the fight wasn't over. The circle's members would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and Marcus and Sarah were now in their crosshairs. With the list of names in hand, Marcus and Sarah went to the police. The investigation that followed was swift and decisive. The circle's members were arrested, their homes searched, and their secrets exposed. The neighborhood, once again, was rocked by scandal. But for Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. He had uncovered the truth about Margaret's past and brought down the circle, but the cost had been high. His home had been vandalized, his family had been put in danger, and the scars of the past would never fully heal. As he stood in his backyard, watching the sun rise over Willow Creek, Marcus felt a sense of closure. The circle was gone, and the neighborhood was finally free. But he knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. There would always be shadows lurking in the corners, waiting to be brought into the light. Epilogue: A New Dawn. Months later, Willow Creek had transformed once again. The neighborhood, now free from the circle's influence, had become a true community. Marcus, Sarah, and their families had formed a bond that went beyond their shared struggle. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. Ethan, now a teenager, had taken an interest in journalism. He wanted to tell the story of Willow Creek's past, to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. Claire's garden had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest times, life could flourish. As for Marcus, he had finally found the peace he had been searching for. He had faced down the shadows of the past and emerged victorious. And though he knew that the fight for justice would never truly end, he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.